Deep in the steaming jungles of the Pacific, war often collapsed into something primal, men crawling through mud, staring into darkness, knowing that death might explode from a shadowed cave at any second. For American Marines and soldiers fighting the Japanese across the islands, caves were nightmares carved in stone, fortresses of rock, defended by men who would rather die than surrender. And inside those caves lay ambushes that could swallow whole platoons. But one weapon, carried not by generals or tanks but slung over the shoulder of an ordinary infantryman, could sometimes turn the tide in an instant. The Browning automatic rifle, the BAR, heavy, brutal, a gun that spat 20 rounds of .30 Ms6 in a single, bone-shaking burst. And on one unforgettable day, a squad of Japanese soldiers learned what it meant when a BAR opened fire into the blackness of their cave, and in just seconds their defiance was reduced to silence. This is the story of courage, survival, and the strange balance between human will and cold steel. A story of how a single weapon became a lifeline for American troops in one of the most unforgiving battlegrounds of World War II. But to understand why Japanese soldiers clung to their caves, and why American infantry had to trust their BAR gunners with their lives, we have to go back to the islands where jungle, stone, and fire became a crucible. Because before that burst of gunfire thundered into the darkness, an entire history of strategy, desperation, and sacrifice had already been written. By 1942, the Japanese Empire stretched like a fortress across the Pacific. From the jungles of New Guinea to the volcanic soil of Iwo Jima, the rising sun had built its defense on a simple principle: never give ground easily. If the Americans wanted the islands, they would have to bleed for every yard. The Imperial Japanese Army understood they could not match America's overwhelming industry. So instead, they turned the terrain itself into a weapon. Caves, ridgelines, and volcanic rock became strongholds. Tunnels ran like arteries beneath the ground, connecting bunkers, artillery, and ambush points. An island wasn't just occupied, it was fortified, transformed into a labyrinth of fire and shadow. For the Americans, these caves became nightmares. Charging a beach was one thing, but rooting out a hidden enemy who would not surrender, who would fight until their last breath, was something else entirely. Conventional rifles sometimes weren't enough. Grenades could flush out defenders, but only if they landed perfectly, and flamethrowers, though effective, were dangerous, heavy, and often a death sentence for the men who carried them. And so, among the most trusted weapons of the infantry was the Browning automatic rifle, the BIR. Born at the end of World War I, the BIR had been designed as a walking fire gun. By World War II, it had evolved into the backbone of American squads. It was not a machine gun in the strictest sense, too heavy for a rifleman, too light to replace a full crew-served weapon, yet in practice, it became the weapon every squad relied upon when the enemy revealed themselves. Each squad had its BAR man, a soldier whose job carried the weight of survival. His bursts could pin down a Japanese charge, silence a machine gun nest, or, in rare, desperate moments, sweep through the darkness of a cave where death waited unseen. And so as the Pacific campaign ground forward, Guadalcanal, Tarawa, Saipan, Peleliu, Iwo Jima, the BAR was there. Carried through mud and volcanic ash, through the choking smoke of flamethrowers and the screams of cave fighting, each island told the same grim truth: this war would be fought not just in open fields or seas, but in the very bones of the earth. And it is in one of those caves where our story turns, where a squad of Japanese soldiers prepared their ambush, and where a single American gunner, gripping the BIR with shaking hands, prepared to fire into darkness. War is often told in terms of divisions, strategies, and nations, but here, in the caves of the Pacific, it narrowed down to something brutally personal: a few men on each side, staring into the unknown, and the human stakes were staggering. In a US infantry squad, the BAR man stood out. His weapon weighed nearly 20 pounds, without counting magazines. That meant extra weight, extra responsibility. To carry the BAR wasn't just to hold firepower, it was to hold the hopes of the squad. For Private First Class Joseph "Joes" Ramirez, a farm boy from Texas who had never left his hometown before the war, being the BAR man meant his comrades looked at him in every firefight. Joe had written to his mother weeks before, "This gun makes me feel like I can keep my friends alive. But it also makes me feel like if I fall, they fall too." Across the cave mouth, Japanese soldiers were waiting. Most were barely older than Joe. Many were conscripts, farmers' sons themselves. But they carried with them the imperial code. Surrender was shame, death in battle was honor. Corporal Hitoshi Tanaka, who had been stationed in China before being shipped to the Pacific, once wrote in his diary, "We are not expected to live. Our duty is to delay the Americans until the Empire finds victory elsewhere. The cave is not our shelter, it is our grave." 2 men, 2 sides. Neither had wanted to be here, on an island thousands of miles from their homes, yet both found themselves crouching in the dirt, clutching weapons, waiting for shadows to move. For Joe, the cave was terror itself, a place where every sound might be his last. For Tanaka, the cave was destiny, a place where death was already decided. As Joe's squad approached the ridgeline, whispers rippled through the men. They knew the Japanese were dug in. They knew caves meant casualties. But no one said it aloud. You didn't talk about who might not make it back. You just kept walking, one foot in front of the other, until the shadows opened their jaws. In just a few moments, Joe Ramirez would raise his barrage, and the fate of both squads, American and Japanese, would collapse into a single burst of gunfire. The jungle was alive with sound, insects, distant gunfire, the muffled thud of artillery. But for Joe Ramirez and his squad, it was the silence ahead that mattered most. The ridge was too quiet, and every man knew what that meant. The Japanese had turned the high ground into a honeycomb of defenses, caves connected to other caves, creating overlapping kill zones. A machine gun could open fire, then vanish into a tunnel. Soldiers could slip unseen through rock passageways and emerge behind advancing Marines. It was warfare designed to suffocate momentum. As Joe's squad approached a jagged outcrop, the lieutenant raised his hand. The men crouched low. Ahead, a cave mouth yawned wide, black as death itself. No sound came from within, no movement. That was the danger. Grenades could be tossed in, but you only had so many. A flamethrower team was on its way, but too far back to help. For now, it was up to the squad in front of that cave. The BAR man SIP's role was clear. If the enemy inside revealed themselves, even for a split second, Joe had to unleash hell. His bursts would pin the enemy, give the riflemen a chance to flank or retreat. His firepower was the shield of the squad. But every Marine also knew the risk. A cave was a perfect ambush. One wrong step could trigger an eruption of bullets, grenades, or bayonet charges from men who did not intend to survive the day. Inside the darkness, Corporal Tanaka and his men waited. They had spent days preparing this moment. Ammunition stacked neatly against the wall, grenades lined up. Their orders were simple: let the Americans get close, then cut them down in one devastating burst. Tanaka whispered to his men, "So, for the Emperor. No one leaves this place." Joe's heart hammered in his chest. His finger hovered over the trigger guard of the BAR. Every step forward deepened the silence. Every second stretched eternity. He could almost feel eyes watching him from the blackness. He swallowed hard, praying his mother's rosary tucked in his pocket might hold some power here. The squad froze. A faint clatter echoed from inside the cave. A sound of metal, a soldier shifting his rifle. The ambush was seconds away. And in that stillness, war was about to erupt. The jungle seemed to hold its breath. Then it came. The cave mouth spat fire. Japanese rifles and a light machine gun cut loose, shredding the air. Joe Sepp's squad dove for cover as bullets ripped bark from trees and chewed craters into the soil. The calm silence of moments before was shattered into chaos. One Marine went down instantly, struck through the chest. Another screamed as shrapnel from a grenade tore into his leg. The squad was pinned, unable to advance, unable to retreat. Every second they lingered in the kill zone meant more bodies on the ground. Joe Ramirez hugged the earth, heart pounding, bearer clutched tight against his chest. He could hear the rattle of his squadmates' Melewan Gurans firing back, but their shots were swallowed by the storm pouring from the cave. The lieutenant shouted, "De Ramirez, suppress that cave! De Ramirez, suppress that cave! De Ramirez," but almost drowned in the fury of fire. Corporal Tanaka urged his men forward. Throw now.
Throw now!
Sedi cried. Grenades rolled toward the cave entrance, ready to be hurled out at the Americans. The defenders could already taste victory. One more rush, one more storm of bullets, and the Marines would be finished. Joe Sepp's hands shook as he fumbled a fresh magazine into the BR. 20 rounds. 20 rounds to change everything. He pressed his cheek to the stock, eyes locked on the black maw of the cave. He knew he couldn't Sepp miss. His squad Sepp's survival depended on what happened in the next heartbeat. And in that moment, crouched in the mud, Joe Ramirez faced the breaking point. If he failed, his friends would die. If he faltered, the cave would erupt again. There was no time to think, only to act. And then, Joe pulled the trigger. The BR roared to life. 20 rounds of .30 Merlo 06 thundered in a single ripping burst, a stream of fire and lead that tore into the black mouth of the cave like a storm unleashed. The effect was immediate. The cave, once spitting death, fell into chaos. Bullets ricocheted inside the confined space, splintering rock, tearing through men who had nowhere to escape. The bear's heavy rounds punched through bodies, through crates of ammunition, through the fragile shield of darkness. Corporal Tanaka shouted for his men to fire back, but his voice was drowned beneath the roar of the BAR. He turned, and in that instant a bullet struck him through the shoulder, spinning him against the cave wall. The grenades he had ordered to be thrown never left the ground. For Joe Ramirez, time seemed to collapse into that single pull of the trigger. His shoulder jolted with the recoil, his vision blurred with smoke and sweat, but he held the weapon steady, pouring every ounce of fear, rage, and desperation into the cave. When the bolt slammed back on an empty magazine, silence fell. Only the echo of the burst lingered in the humid air. The Marines waited. Rifles trained, hearts pounding. No shots came back, no grenades rolled out, only the faint, broken moans of dying men within the shadows. In those few seconds, the ambush had been broken. The Japanese squad that had waited days to slaughter the Marines was silent, cut down not by artillery, not by flamethrowers, but by one man and one weapon. He had not just pulled a trigger, he had saved his squad. But the war was not finished. That cave was only one of hundreds, and for every silence earned in blood and fire, another shadow waited ahead. The battlefield does not allow hesitation. Even as the echoes of Joe Sepp's burst faded, the squad knew the danger wasn't stead over. Caves were treacherous. Silence could mean death waiting inside. Every step forward could trigger another ambush. The lieutenant barked orders. A grenade was lobbed into the blackness. It detonated with a thunderous crack, shaking the earth. The Marines waited, then moved in, rifles raised, BAR reloaded, and ready to fire again. Inside, the scene was grim. The BAR Sepp's rounds had shredded everything in their path. Several Japanese soldiers lay sprawled across the stone floor, their weapons beside them. Ammunition crates splintered, grenades scattered, unexploded. The once lethal ambush point had become a tomb. Still, the Americans knew better than to assume victory. A wounded enemy soldier could rise in a final act of defiance. One Marine fired into a corner where a figure stirred. Another prodded the tunnel walls with his bayonet, ensuring no hidden passage remained. Every movement was methodical, deliberate. The cave had to be cleared fully before the squad could breathe. In the dirt beside one fallen soldier, they found a tattered diary. In it, words scribbled only days before, "We will not return. This place is where we end. Better to die like the tiger in his cave than to crawl like the rat in the open." It was a stark reminder of what they faced, men who had already accepted death before the battle began. For Joe Ramirez, the aftermath was surreal. He leaned against the ridge, hands trembling, ears still ringing. His squad slapped his back, muttered thanks. But he barely heard them. He kept seeing the flashes inside the cave, the chaos of that single burst. He had done what was asked. He had saved them. And yet, part of him wondered how many young men, not so different from himself, had fallen to those 20 rounds. The cave was secured. The ridge line could now be taken, and the squad moved on, step by step, toward the next shadow, the next fight. Because in the Pacific, victory wasn't set to a single moment. It was a grinding march through countless battles, each one as merciless as the last. The cave had been a death trap. A single squad of Japanese soldiers could have halted the American advance for hours, even days. But Joe Ramirez's burst from the BAR turned the tide in seconds. What had been certain disaster for his squad became opportunity. With the cave silenced, the Marines surged up the ridge. Other squads joined, leapfrogging past the position Joe had cleared. Grenades and satchel charges were tossed into neighboring openings, sealing tunnels. Flamethrowers scorched chambers where defenders still clung to their positions. What could have been a grinding, bloody stalemate shifted into momentum. The Japanese defense on that ridge began to collapse. Their ambush had failed. Their stronghold had been cracked open by one decisive moment. Inside the connected tunnels, panic rippled. Corporal Tanaka, bleeding and half-conscious, urged his remaining men to keep fighting. But their position was untenable. Without the cave's killing zone, the ridge could no longer hold. What had begun as a confident ambush dissolved into chaos and retreat. For the Americans, this was the reversal. What had seemed like a trap became a breakthrough, and the name whispered among the squad that day, in voices hoarse from smoke and gunpowder, was Ramirez, the BAR man who had broken the silence with 20 rounds. Yet, victory in the Pacific was never clean. For every ridge taken, another waited ahead. For every cave silenced, another was dug into the stone. Joe knew this. His squad knew this. The war was far from over. But in that moment, on that ridge, the impossible had happened. A squad of Marines stood alive where minutes earlier death had seemed certain, and that survival, that fragile miracle, was enough to carry them forward. History remembers grand strategies, famous generals, decisive campaigns, but sometimes it turns on something far smaller, a single soldier, in a single place, pulling a single trigger at the right time. When the gunfire faded and the ridge fell silent, the Marines counted their losses. 2 men wounded, 1 killed outright, a price lighter than expected, but heavy enough for those who knew the faces behind the names. In the Pacific, survival always came at a cost. Joe Ramirez sat apart from the squad, BR resting across his knees. His comrades clapped him on the back, called him a hero, but Joe barely spoke. His ears still rang from the burst, his hands still shook. In his pocket, his mother's rosary pressed against his skin. He whispered a prayer, not of victory, but of forgiveness. For the men who had died in that cave, and for himself, for having been the instrument of their end. Corporal Hitoshi Tanaka did not survive his wound. His diary, later recovered by US intelligence, revealed his final thoughts. "We are told America is rich, that its soldiers are soft, but today I saw their fire. We die here, but perhaps that is as it should be. To live without honor is worse than this silence." It was a glimpse into the mind of an enemy who, though fierce, was human all the same, a man far from home, bound to a duty he could not escape. The ridge was only one step in a long campaign. Ahead lay more caves, more fire, more blood. The Pacific Theater was an endless repetition of such scenes. Ambush and counterattack, silence and eruption, caves turned into tombs. And yet, the men marched on. For Joe, the war did not end on that ridge. He carried the memory of the cave with him, through the islands, through the rest of the Pacific campaign. And when he returned home, years later, he would never again see a darkened doorway without hearing the echo of that burst. History records that the United States won the war in the Pacific, that islands were taken, that Japan eventually surrendered. But for the men who fought in those caves, victory was measured not in headlines or treaties, but in the faces of the comrades who walked beside them, alive, for one more day. In the vast scale of World War II, it is easy to lose sight of the small moments, a single firefight, a single burst of gunfire, yet it is often in those moments that the war was truly fought and won. The caves of the Pacific became crucibles of courage and terror, where young men carried burdens larger than themselves. For Joe Ramirez, the BIR was more than a weapon. It was the weight of survival, the line between life and death for his squad. For Corporal Tanaka and his men, the cave was more than a fortress. It was a place to fulfill a duty they had been taught was greater than their own lives. Two men, strangers, enemies, yet both bound by forces far beyond their control. Their clash in the shadows reminds us that history is not only about nations and generals, it is about individuals, human beings, each with hopes, fears, and final moments that mattered deeply. Today the caves stand silent. Nature reclaims them. Vines creep over stone. Birds nest where men once fought. But if you stand at those openings, you can almost feel the echoes of what happened there. The silence carries weight, a reminder of the lives cut short and the courage displayed. The legacy of that burst is not just a tactical victory, it is a testament to resilience. The way ordinary soldiers, unremarkable in civilian life, rose to extraordinary acts when the moment demanded it. And it leaves us with questions that echo long after the guns have gone silent. What does courage mean when survival hangs by a thread? What does honor mean when men are ordered to die in caves thousands of miles from home? And what does it mean for us, living in the shadow of their sacrifices, to remember them not as faceless soldiers, but as human beings? History lives in these stories, and when we remember them, with clarity, with humanity, we carry forward the lessons they left behind.